You think you already know what it means to put God first. Most people who hear that phrase nod slowly, maybe even feel a warm familiarity with it, as if they have always understood it, as if it were a gentle reminder rather than a seismic reordering. But look closer at the world where that idea was first lived out, and you will find something far more demanding, far more concrete, and far more transformative than anything a motivational phrase could contain. What did it actually cost a person in first-century Judea to reorganize their entire life around one singular loyalty? What changed in the way they saw their neighbors, managed their money, raised their children, or faced their fears? And what does any of that have to do with the 7 very specific shifts that happen when someone genuinely crosses that threshold today? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the life Jesus was actually inviting people into. In the hill country north of Jerusalem, in the decades just before the Common Era, life was organized around a logic that was visible in every material detail of how people built, planted, traded, and worshipped. A household in a Galilean village was not simply a family unit, it was a theological statement. The structure of the house itself, the common sleeping area, the lower room where animals were brought in at night for warmth, the grain stored in sealed jars against the wall, the olive oil carefully rationed in ceramic lamps, all of it expressed a fundamental conviction that survival depended on alignment with powers greater than yourself. If this channel has been adding depth to your reading of Scripture, consider subscribing. What comes next in this story reaches into the foundation of everything Jesus said about wealth, anxiety, and trust. The God of Israel in that world was not an abstract theological category. He was the one who sent rain or withheld it. He was the one who blessed the womb or closed it. He was woven into the agricultural calendar with the kind of precision that modern life has made almost impossible to imagine. Every harvest was simultaneously an economic event and a theological verdict. If your barley came up sparse, you did not simply consult an agronomist. You examined your relationship with the divine. This is the world in which the first change becomes visible. The first thing that changes when you put God above all else is how you perceive provision. In Galilee, a smallholder farmer worked land that rarely exceeded what one family could manage. The growing season was short. The soil in many regions was thin over limestone, and water was not guaranteed. A man who rose before dawn to check on his seedlings was not being industrious in the modern entrepreneurial sense. He was watching for signs, watching to see whether what he had planted into the ground would be returned to him, multiplied or diminished, by forces he could not control. Jesus walked through that landscape. He watched those farmers. He knew what it felt like to stand at the edge of a field and calculate whether what was growing would be enough. When he said, in the Sermon on the Mount, "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" He was not offering a nature metaphor plucked from abstract poetry. He was speaking to people who understood scarcity as a physical weight that pressed down on every morning. The person who puts God above all else does not stop working. They do not pretend that effort is irrelevant. What shifts is the internal architecture of their anxiety. The farmer who trusts in God above all else still rises before dawn and still checks the seedlings. But the relationship between effort and outcome has been rearranged in their interior life. They work as those who plant. They receive as those who trust. The frantic grip of control, the thing that turns provision into obsession, begins to loosen. In practice, this meant something very specific in that ancient economy. It meant releasing a portion of the harvest, the tithe, the corner of the field left for the gleaner, the forgiveness of debt in the sabbatical year, not as a grudging religious obligation, but as a lived expression of the conviction that the land ultimately belonged to God, and that the harvest was gift before it was reward. That posture, repeated season after season, rewired how a person related to what they owned and what they feared losing. And that rewiring is the first of 7 transformations. Perception of provision changes, not in theory, but in the grain stored against the wall, in the lamp carefully filled, in the hand that releases rather than hoards. The second thing that changes when you put God above all else is how you relate to other people. There is a detail in the architecture of first-century Galilean villages that most modern readers of the New Testament pass over without noticing. Houses were not arranged in isolated lots, separated by fences and private lawns. They were built in clusters, sharing walls, sharing courtyards, sharing water sources. The family compound, the insula, as archaeologists sometimes call it, was a physical arrangement that made privacy, in the modern sense, almost impossible. You knew when your neighbor ground grain before dawn. You heard the arguments through the mud brick wall. You smelled what was being cooked. You were aware, at a granular and inescapable level, of whether the household next to yours was eating well or going hungry. In that kind of proximity, the question of who you regarded as your neighbor was not abstract. It was architectural. It was sensory. It was settled every morning when the courtyard gate opened and the daily negotiation of shared space began. Jesus was asked, in the Gospel of Luke, by a legal expert who wanted to test him. And who is my neighbor? The man was not asking a philosophical question. He was asking a boundary question. He was asking where the obligation ended. In a world of overlapping loyalties, family, village, clan, tribe, religious faction, ethnic group, knowing the boundary of your relational obligation was a survival calculation. Resources were finite. Loyalty was capital. You could not afford to extend it without limit. The parable Jesus told in response, the man beaten on the road to Jericho, passed by a priest and a Levite, tended to by a Samaritan, was not simply a story about kindness. It was a dismantling of the boundary logic entirely. The priest and the Levite who passed were not villains. By the religious and social calculation of their world, they were being prudent. Ritual purity, clan loyalty, the avoidance of entanglement with a situation that might compromise their standing. These were not petty concerns. They were the operating system of a life organized around carefully managed obligations. The Samaritan had no such operating system running between himself and the beaten man. And that absence, that suspension of the boundary calculus, is precisely what Jesus held up as the model. When God is placed above all else, the invisible walls that structure human relating begin to come down, not all at once, and not without resistance. But the logic that says my loyalty extends this far and no further starts to lose its authority. Because if the one you serve is also the one who made the person bleeding on the road, then the boundary between neighbor and stranger has been dissolved at its theological root. This is not a comfortable transformation. In a Galilean village, it would have meant extending hospitality to people whose presence created social risk. It would have meant sharing grain in a lean year with a family from the wrong lineage. It would have meant sitting at table, the most intimate social act in that world, with people whose company damaged your reputation. Jesus did all of these things repeatedly, with apparent deliberateness, and the social friction it generated was real and documented in every gospel. The third thing that changes is how you handle fear. Fear in the ancient world was not primarily the psychological anxiety that modern therapeutic vocabulary addresses. It was an economic and social reality with specific textures. Fear of drought, fear of debt, and the loss of land that followed it. Fear of Roman taxation, which in Galilee under Herod Antipas consumed an estimated 40% of agricultural output between tribute, temple tax, and local levies. Fear of illness, because illness in that world meant not only suffering, but exclusion. The leper was not merely sick. They were cast outside the boundary of the village, economically and relationally severed from everything that sustained life. The person who organized their life around survival, and in first-century Galilee, that was nearly everyone, carried a fear that was structural, not merely emotional. It lived in the gap between what the harvest produced and what the tax collector demanded. It lived in the calculation every head of household made between the grain stored in the jar and the number of mouths in the compound. Jesus spoke into that specific fear with a precision that only someone who understood it from the inside could manage. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. That sentence, heard by a subsistence farmer in Galilee, was not a therapeutic suggestion. It was a radical reorientation of the entire survival logic. What makes it more than naive optimism is the structure of the argument Jesus builds around it. He does not say, "Do not be anxious, because everything will work out." He says, "Do not be anxious because your Father knows that you need these things." The shift is not from fear to denial. It is from fear organized around your own resources to trust organized around a different source entirely. When God is placed above all else, fear does not disappear. What changes is its anchor point. The person who has reorganized their interior life around God's supremacy still perceives danger, still acts prudently, still prepares and plans. But the fear no longer governs. It no longer makes the final decision about what is possible, what is safe, what must be protected at all costs. The grain in the jar is still counted, but the counting is no longer an act of desperation. In visible, practical terms, this transformation shows itself in the capacity to act generously in conditions that would otherwise produce hoarding, to remain present to others when self-protection would counsel withdrawal, and to make decisions based on what is right rather than what is safe. These are not small things. In a world of scarcity and social risk, they represent a fundamental reordering of how a human being moves through the day. The fourth thing that changes when you put God above all else is how you use power. Power in the ancient Mediterranean world was not an abstraction. It was a material reality with a precise and visible grammar. It lived in the arrangement of bodies at a dinner table, who reclined closest to the host, who was seated at the far end, who was made to stand. It lived in the public greeting, in whether a person of higher status acknowledged you in the marketplace or looked through you as if you were part of the street furniture. It lived in the debt relationship, where a creditor held not merely a financial claim over a debtor, but a form of social ownership that extended to the borrower's labor, land, and, in extreme cases, the freedom of their children. In Herod's Galilee, the concentration of power was not a political grievance in the modern sense. It was the atmospheric condition of daily life. The large estates that had expanded across the fertile valleys of Jezreel and around the Sea of Galilee were worked by tenant farmers who had, in many cases, been smallholders a generation earlier, men whose fathers had owned their land, who had lost it to debt during years of poor harvest or crushing taxation, and who now worked the same fields as tenants, surrendering a portion of what they grew to a landlord they rarely saw. The parable of the prodigal son is often read as a story about repentance and forgiveness. And it is. But it is also a story about the use of power, specifically about a father who, at the moment of maximum social leverage, chooses not to use it. When the son returns, having squandered his inheritance among Gentiles, an act of cultural and religious betrayal layered on top of financial recklessness, the father's position in that village society would have entitled him to a formal and public shaming. The son would have been met at the village boundary by the community ritual known by scholars as the kezazah, a ceremony in which a pot was broken before a disgraced person, symbolizing their severance from the community. The father, by running toward the son and publicly embracing him before that ritual could unfold, was using his own social standing as a shield. He was absorbing the shame that the community intended to inflict on the son, taking it onto himself, and then throwing a feast that announced to everyone watching, "This is how I choose to use what I have." When God is placed above all else, the logic of power is inverted, not because power disappears, the father in the parable still has it, but because the purpose it serves changes entirely. Power is no longer held as an instrument of protection, status maintenance, or leverage. It becomes a resource that can be spent on behalf of others, particularly those with none. This is not a small shift. In a world where social standing was the primary currency of security, choosing to spend yours on the protection of someone who had no claim on you was economically irrational and socially risky. Jesus lived this out with a consistency that eventually became fatal. He spent his social capital on lepers, on tax collectors, on women of compromised reputation, on Samaritans, on children, on precisely those categories of person who could offer nothing in return, and whose company cost him something real each time. The fifth thing that changes is how you experience time. This one requires the most careful unpacking, because it touches something that the ancient world felt with an immediacy that modernity has largely dissolved. In Galilee, time was not a personal resource to be optimized. It was a shared structure, given its shape by the rhythms of the agricultural year, the Sabbath, the pilgrimage festivals, and the daily cycles of prayer that marked morning, afternoon, and evening with a regularity as physical as the movement of light across the courtyard stones. A person did not own their time in the way a modern person does. Time was held in common, organized by obligations that were simultaneously social, economic, and religious. The Sabbath is the clearest material expression of this. One day in 7, every tool was set down. The plow rested. The loom was silent. The merchant closed his stall. The debt collector could not collect. In practical terms, for a subsistence farmer, the Sabbath represented a significant economic sacrifice. 1/7 of the potential working hours of every week, released by command rather than by choice. And it applied not only to the head of household, but to every person and animal under that household's authority. The servant rested. The ox rested. The land itself, every 7th year, was released from cultivation entirely. What this calendar encoded, in physical and rhythmic form, was the conviction that time did not ultimately belong to you, that the pressure to extract maximum productivity from every available hour was a form of idolatry, a way of living as if your survival depended entirely on your own output. The Sabbath interrupted that narrative with structural regularity. Once a week, the entire system was required to admit that it did not run on human effort alone. When God is placed above all else, the relationship with time undergoes precisely this kind of reordering. The frantic filling of every hour, the anxiety-driven productivity that modern culture has elevated into a virtue, begins to reveal itself for what it is: a theological statement about where ultimate trust is placed. The person who cannot stop, who cannot rest, who measures their worth by their output, and experiences stillness as failure, is not simply tired. They have organized their life around a conviction that they cannot afford to articulate aloud, but which every overcrowded hour expresses clearly. I do not trust anyone but myself to secure what I need. The Sabbath, in this light, is not a religious rule. It is a weekly act of surrender, a practiced relinquishment of control, repeated until the posture becomes habitual. And that habituation changes not only how a person rests, but how they work. Hours given back to God return with a different quality of attention. Tasks undertaken from a place of rootedness rather than desperation produce a different quality of presence. The person who has learned to stop has also learned, in some deep and transferable way, that the world does not depend on their never stopping. The sixth thing that changes when you put God above all else is how you face suffering. There is a scene in the Gospel of John that is easy to read past if you are moving quickly. Jesus arrives at the tomb of Lazarus 4 days after his friend's death and finds Mary and the other mourners weeping. The text says, with a brevity that is almost shocking in its restraint, that Jesus wept. He wept, not as a performance of grief for the benefit of the crowd, not as a theological demonstration. The Greek word used, edakrusin, describes quiet, personal tears distinct from the loud ritual wailing of the mourners around him. This is a man who, the Gospel has already told us, is about to reverse what has just happened. He knows what he is about to do. He weeps anyway. That detail is not incidental. It is the center of everything. In the ancient world, suffering was interpreted through two dominant frameworks, and neither of them left much room for what Jesus did at that tomb. The first framework, the one most common in the Judaism of his day, though not universal, understood suffering as consequence. Pain was the result of sin, either personal or ancestral. The man born blind in John chapter 9 had his blindness explained by the disciples themselves as punishment, either his own sin or his parents. The framework was tidy, morally legible, and deeply comforting to those who were not currently suffering. It explained the world. It assigned cause and effect. It placed the afflicted person at a comprehensible distance from the healthy observer. The second framework, the Stoic philosophy that permeated educated Greco-Roman culture and had reached even into Galilee through trade and occupation, counseled detachment. Suffering was real, but the wise person cultivated an inner citadel impervious to it. You could not always control what happened to your body, your household, your city. You could control your response. The sage did not weep at the tomb. The sage observed the tomb from a place of cultivated equanimity and continued, undisturbed, toward virtue. Jesus did neither. He did not explain Lazarus's death as consequence, and he did not observe it from behind the glass of philosophical detachment. He entered it. He stood inside the grief of the people who loved Lazarus and allowed their reality to become his own. And then he acted from within that solidarity, not from above it. When God is placed above all else, suffering is no longer something to be explained away or endured at arm's length. The person who has reorganized their life around God's supremacy discovers, often slowly and only through lived experience, that suffering can be inhabited rather than merely survived. The grief does not shrink. The loss does not become less real. What changes is the posture in which it is carried. There is a companionship available in it, not a resolution, not a theological explanation, but a presence that transforms suffering from pure devastation into something that, impossibly, can be endured and even, in time, integrated. This is not a comfort that can be argued into existence. It is one that is discovered, if at all, only by those who have actually placed God at the center and then encountered something that threatened to displace him. The transformation is not theoretical. It is forged in the specific texture of real loss, and it produces a quality of resilience, not hardness, but rootedness, that no purely human coping strategy can replicate. The seventh and final thing that changes is the most fundamental: how you understand yourself. In the village economy of first-century Galilee, identity was almost entirely external. You were the son of your father, the member of your tribe, the inhabitant of your village, the practitioner of your trade. The interior life, the private self with its doubts, its wounds, its secret aspirations, had very little of the cultural scaffolding that modern Western society has built to support it. You were not primarily an individual with a psychology. You were a node in a network of relationships and obligations, and your value was measured by how well you fulfilled the role that network assigned you. This is why the tax collector was not merely disliked. He had severed himself from the network. He had sold his relational belonging to Rome in exchange for money, and in doing so had forfeited the identity that the village structure could provide. This is why the woman with the hemorrhage, 12 years of bleeding, 12 years of ritual impurity, 12 years of being untouchable, was not merely ill. She had lost the social architecture through which a person in that world knew who they were. This is why Zacchaeus, climbing a tree to see Jesus pass through Jericho, is such a precise portrait of a man who has everything the system values: wealth, authority, a Roman contract, and has been hollowed out by it. Jesus, in every one of these encounters, did something that went deeper than healing the physical condition or resolving the social problem. He named the person. He spoke to the interior self that the social architecture had either never acknowledged or actively erased. "Zacchaeus, come down," he said. Not tax collector, not traitor, not Roman collaborator. A name, spoken in public, before anything had been repented of or restored. When God is placed above all else, the source from which you derive your identity shifts. It moves from the external network of performance and social validation to something that cannot be revoked by failure, disgrace, poverty, illness, or the verdict of the community. This does not mean that reputation becomes irrelevant or that relationships stop mattering. It means that the deepest question, who am I when everything that defines me externally is stripped away, has received an answer that does not depend on any of those external conditions. That answer is what produces the specific quality of freedom that runs through every encounter Jesus has with people who have genuinely crossed this threshold. The freedom of the woman who anoints his feet in the middle of a Pharisee's dinner, indifferent to the room's judgment. The freedom of Peter, stepping out of the boat. The freedom of the disciples who left their nets, not because the fishing was bad, but because something else had become, for the first time in their lives, more real than the thing they had built their entire existence around. This is what the 7 changes, taken together, describe. Not a set of improved behaviors or spiritual disciplines, a different center of gravity. A life whose organizing principle has been replaced at its root, and which therefore moves through the world, through scarcity and abundance, through power and powerlessness, through grief and joy, through every ordinary hour of every ordinary day, with a quality of groundedness that the world around it can perceive, but cannot easily explain. Jesus walked through Galilee and found people carrying the full weight of that world on their shoulders. The taxes, the drought, the debts, the shame, the illness, the fear. He did not offer them relief from those conditions, at least not primarily. He offered them a different foundation beneath those conditions, a place to stand that did not shift when everything above it shifted. And the people who accepted that offer found, one by one, and in precisely the 7 ways this narrative has traced, that the life they were now living was recognizably the same life, in the same world, under the same pressures, and utterly irreversibly different.